idea of remaking or rebooting Game of Thrones has been discussed by fans in a lot more depth than you might first imagine for a show that aired its final season in 2019. But the final season of the show was so widely rejected by both hardcore and more casual audiences. Before the final season had even finished airing, fans were discussing a remake. So it was not a surprise that once the final episode's credits rolled, that multiple petitions were made to try and get that final season remade. An understandable sentiment, but wholly unrealistic in reality. But as more time has passed since Season 8, and the success of House of the Dragon in relighting the imagination of the fanbase, these fans began to discuss the idea of HBO rebooting the show from the start, rather than just Season 8. This time, the discussion was not just limited to the darkest corners of the fandom, but also several big media sites have been discussing this idea as well. Again, it does seem like this is wholly unrealistic, but recently something happened that I think makes the chances of a reboot happening sooner rather than later much more likely. The announcement of the Harry Potter books being adapted into a TV show for Max, HBO and Warner Bros. Discovery streaming service. This announcement caught a lot of people, including myself, off guard, mainly because the final Harry Potter film only came out 10 years ago. As a whole, the films are of good quality and have aged well over the last 10 years. So it does seem a bit odd to remake the books as a TV show. There didn't seem to be a huge hunger in the fanbase for this new adaptation. So it really seems like the drive for this project is coming from within Warner Bros. Discovery. If you look at this from a business point of view, Harry Potter is a very successful franchise. However, the universe has become a bit stuck in the mud thanks to the lackluster performance of the Fantastic Beasts movies, both financially and critically. Warner Bros. Discovery need to breathe life back into the property, but they also need content for Max. It seems like a win-win situation to bring a TV adaptation to reality. It gives the franchise new life, and HBO and Warner Bros. Discovery know fans will watch it. So when you look at it from a money point of view, it does kind of make sense why they would be rebooting Harry Potter so soon. However, if they want to make this reboot work so soon after the movies, they have to draw on what people loved about them, but also make the show distinct enough from the films. It sounds like they're going to be doing this by adapting the books to screen a lot more closely than the films could, thanks to having a much longer runtime to play with. If I had my way, I would set this reboot in the 90s like the books, rather than try and make it modern day. Now the question fans have been asking is if Warner Bros. Discovery and HBO are willing to put so much money into a reboot of Harry Potter so soon after the films, then that surely makes the prospect of a Game of Thrones reboot sooner rather than later more likely. Now before I break this down, I always thought a Harry Potter TV reboot was inevitable. So soon? No. But I did think it would happen eventually. I always felt the same about Game of Thrones, that at some point it would be rebooted. In my head I was thinking like 20 years or so, as despite the flawed writing, visually and technically the show holds up quite well. But this news about Harry Potter does make me reassess the timescale of the proposed Game of Thrones reboot. There are lots of similarities between this and the Potter reboot, namely that the recent popularity of the property has fallen somewhat thanks to lackluster projects. And of course, HBO and Warner Bros. Need to make money. A reboot could fix the issues fans had with the show while also making a huge amount of money for them and giving them content for Max. When you look at it that way, you can kind of see how a reboot might make a lot of sense. But there are some big issues with this idea. House of the Dragon was a much bigger success than anyone could have predicted. Plus, we have several other spin-offs in the works. If it was not for these projects, I think a rebooted Game of Thrones would be much more likely. However, I believe the focus right now is clearly on these spin-offs and making them successful and creating a wider A Song of Ice and Fire universe on TV. Then we also have the rumoured Jon Snow spin-off series, which is supposed to be set after the events of Season 8. While I don't think there is a lot I think could be done in this Jon Snow spin-off concept that fixes the larger issues with Season 8 or the later seasons of Game of Thrones, I very much see HBO using it as an attempt to retcon some of the poorer elements of the ending somewhat. I've seen a lot of people speculate that it could be a pseudo Season 9 if you will. While it's not been confirmed yet and is still in development, I do actually think this project does happen. I think HBO will want to see how well it does, and if it does do some damage control. Do I think it would work? No, I don't. But I think they'd rather try and fix the issues if they can. We also have the issue that, as things stand right now, if they did do a reboot soon, they would inevitably still run out of books eventually, which was part of the wider issue of why Game of Thrones did go off the rails after they ran out of book material. Who knows though, maybe with better and more competent writers that care about the property, this might not actually be a big issue. But I know for many fans, it's when the show went off book, it went downhill fast. I also question how successful the reboot could be. Part of the draw of the early seasons of Game of Thrones, and why it catapulted in the mainstream public consciousness, was shocking twists that viewers didn't really see coming. Ned Stark's death and the Red Wedding, for example. Would there be as much of a hunger for the show if most of the fans watching already knew what was going to happen? There are some good elements to this idea, however. Much like the idea behind the Harry Potter reboot, being much closer to the books, I think a Game of Thrones reboot would tread the same path and follow the published books much more closely. Yes, you would still have the issues of the books not being finished, but as I argued before, maybe a better team of writers who actually want to work on the project might be able to do a better job when they get past the book material. More so, given following the books would make it easier to carry on after you run out of the material. One idea that I think would make a reboot more feasible is if you animated it rather than did it in live action. I always felt animation would be a great way to tell the story, while giving the story the scale it needs to have that just wouldn't be practical in live action. Not having to cut things due to budget or practicalities of filming. Not only that, but the different style would make the reboot distinct enough from the original show that it gives fans who watched it before a different take on it. So the heart of the question comes down to this. Will HBO reboot Game of Thrones? I think yes, they will at some point, be that in live action or maybe an animated project. I also think any reboot will go out of their way to stick to the book more than the show did before, and learn from the mistakes of the past. I do think there are a lot of issues with the idea. Namely, would there really be a real hunger for such a project? Or would HBO be willing to commit the money it would need to make it successful? But regardless, I do think at some point it does happen. And I do think it will happen sooner than people think. Maybe in the next 10 years rather than the 20 I thought before. But right now I think HBO are happy doing spin-offs given the success of House of the Dragon. And there's a lot more stories in the world of Ice and Fire that are still left to tell. The question I want to ask you guys though is, do you think a Game of Thrones reboot could ever happen? Be that in 20 years, be it in 10 years, be it live action or animation. What would you want to see and how would you want it handled differently? And what do you think the bigger issues with a reboot could be?